The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above Mercy General's ICU as Katie Rodriguez moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost moving through her own life. 6 in the morning, Tuesday, the kind of shift that belonged to nurses nobody remembered, the invisible ones who changed bedpans while doctors slept and families went home to warm houses. She pushed the medication cart down the corridor, each wheel squeaking in rhythm, a sound she'd learned to move with instead of against. Her scrubs were navy blue, same color as 3 years' worth of scrubs, same color as the uniform she would never wear again. The unit patch was still there. She felt it before she felt anything else each morning, her fingers brushing against the lining of her civilian jacket hanging in her locker, the faded embroidered emblem rough beneath her fingertips like scar tissue. 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. A unit that officially no longer remembered her, and a unit she was forbidden to mention. Katie reached into her locker and withdrew her badge, pinning it to her chest with the same mechanical precision she'd used for 1,000 other mornings. The metal was cold against her palm. She held it for a second longer than necessary, then let it go. The limp was barely noticeable after physical therapy, but it was there if you looked, a leftward shift in weight every 4th step, the souvenir of shrapnel from Sangin that had been extracted by a surgeon in Kandahar while she was still conscious enough to count the stitches. 23. She'd made a joke about it. The surgeon hadn't laughed. Katie pulled her long sleeves down to her wrists, covering the pale scars that mapped the story of a life that no longer existed, then she turned toward the patient ward. Mercy General's ICU occupied the 3rd floor of a building constructed in 1987, all institutional beige and the smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the underneath, the smell of bodies failing, of families waiting, of interventions just barely holding back the dark. She knew every corner of this hospital the way a soldier knows the layout of a forward operating base. She knew which monitors needed recalibrating, which for pumps made that high-pitched whine at exactly 0615, which nurses took their coffee black at the break room station and which took 3 sugars and cream. She knew everything about this place except how to leave it in a way that kept her alive. Dr. Marcus Hargrove entered the break room at 0633, moving with the confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades building a kingdom out of seniority and surgical precision. He was tall, the kind of tall that registered as authority in rooms where tall men got listened to, and his white coat had the pressed crispness of someone who understood that fabric was part of the power equation. His eyes swept across the break room like security cameras, cataloging and dismissing. There was Katie Rodriguez, sitting in the corner with her coffee, not speaking, not drawing attention, just breathing quietly in a way that suggested she might dissolve if anyone looked directly at her. Perfect. Hargrove had learned long ago that the most useful people were the ones who understood they were useful precisely because they could vanish. He'd been reading her file since she arrived 3 years ago, back when he'd been searching for nurses who would work the shifts he assigned without complaint. Temporary agency placement. No references that checked out completely, there was something off about the dates, gaps that didn't align, a vagueness in her previous employment history that had made him curious until he realized he didn't actually care. She was competent. She was quiet. She kept her eyes down. These were the only variables that mattered. The fact that his network of hospital board members had never been able to extract clean background information made her even more valuable. She had something to hide, and people who had something to hide were people you could leverage. Katie didn't look up from her coffee, but she felt him enter the way animals feel atmospheric pressure changes. The shift in air weight, the displacement of space by a presence that demanded to occupy it. She'd learned not to flinch at those moments. Flinching was the first step toward revealing something, a recognition, a reaction, a memory firing in the eyes. She kept her fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug and her gaze fixed on the beige wall across from her. The admissions alert came through at 0714, the overhead speaker crackling to life with that particular tone of controlled urgency that meant significant trauma. Cardiac complications, possible tamponade, Commander James Vickers, USMC, transferred from the VA complex with a 20-minute transport ETA. Katie's hand stopped moving. The mug remained suspended halfway to her mouth. For 3 seconds, 4, 5, her entire nervous system went quiet in a way that doctors would call shock and military personnel would call recognition. Commander James Vickers. The name was a key, and the key was opening a door she had sealed shut so completely she'd nearly convinced herself the room behind it didn't exist. The letters. Miguel had shown her the letters his commanding officer sent home during the deployment, printed on thin military stationery, handwriting that was precise and measured and human. "Your son is a leader," the letters said. "The men follow him because they trust him. I wanted you to know that." That was the commander. That was the man whose recommendation had been part of what kept Miguel alive in Sangin, because you survived combat when the right people believed in you, when leadership had the kind of judgment that calculated risk instead of eating it like ammunition. Katie set the mug down with the kind of care she would use lowering an explosive. She rose from the chair without sound. She'd learned how to move through hospital hallways the way she'd once moved through hostile territory, all weight distribution and minimum displacement. The limp was invisible when she concentrated. She gathered her badge, her notes, her posture, and she put on the face she'd been perfecting for 3 years, the face of someone so ordinary that nobody looked twice. By 07:26, Commander Vickers was being wheeled into ICU Bay 7, his daughter gripping one side of the stretcher while his wife held his hand. The man himself was conscious, his breathing labored, his color the particular shade of gray that meant his cardiovascular system was betraying him in ways that machines would have to compensate for. Katie approached the bay from the medication station, her chart already in hand, her movements efficient and anonymous. She began the initial assessment without speaking, of blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, checking the 4 lines that had been placed during transport. The numbers were bad. Systolic reading of 88, heart rate climbing past 110, O2 sat already compensating at 94% on room air. She was reaching for the cardiac monitor leads when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his presence announcing itself before his voice did. "Nurse Rodriguez," he said, and something about the way he shaped the syllables made it sound like a diagnosis nobody wanted to hear. "I'll be taking lead on this case. The patient is a military officer, which means protocol demands precision. I need someone who understands that precision is not an area where we entertain flexibility." Katie didn't look at him. She applied the monitor leads to Vickers' chest with the kind of automatic expertise that came from having done it hundreds of times, her fingers steady as a surgical laser, her movements the opposite of hurried. The electrodes adhered smoothly. The monitor beeping began, establishing its rhythm, sinus tachycardia, elevated but regular, the pattern of a heart working too hard. "The patient has been symptomatic for 20 hours, Katie said, her voice the kind of quiet that didn't demand to be listened to. Chest pain radiating to his shoulder? Neck vein distension visible on arrival. Muffled heart sounds in the report from the VA. His wife indicates he's been increasingly short of breath since this morning." Dr. Hargrove nodded, accepting the information the way a king accepts tribute. He moved closer to Vickers, his hand extending toward the patient's shoulder in a gesture that was supposed to convey confidence and expertise. "Commander, I'm Dr. Hargrove. You're in excellent hands. We'll have you stabilized within the hour." The promise was made with the casual certainty of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with enough authority applied firmly enough. Katie continued the assessment, checking the monitor readout, noting the subtle waveform changes that suggested increased pressure in the thoracic cavity. The numbers were telling a story, and the story was getting worse. She'd read the initial imaging from the VA, and no clear findings, but the clinical picture was pointing toward something that ultrasound would have to verify, something that would require the right procedure performed by someone who understood the anatomy well enough not to improvise. "Prepare him for a full cardiac workup," Hargrove said, the order directed at Katie in a tone that suggested he was addressing a device rather than a person. "EKG, echocardiogram, chest X-ray, full labs. I want him stripped and ready for intervention within the hour if imaging confirms what I suspect." Katie nodded without speaking. She began gathering the equipment they would need, the EKG leads, the ultrasound machine being wheeled in from the hallway by another tech, the arterial line kit for the blood draws that would come next. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this exact sequence thousands of times, but something inside her had shifted, some internal mechanism that recognized danger in a way that had nothing to do with medical pathology. Vickers' daughter reached out and touched Katie's arm as she passed. Is he going to be okay? The question was barely audible, the kind of desperate hope that had no basis in medical reality but was the only thing keeping her standing. Katie paused, just a second, just enough to register the contact, then she met the young woman's eyes. "We're going to find out what's happening," she said. It wasn't an answer. It was something better than an answer. It was honest. She moved back to the monitor, checking the cardiac rhythm again, noting the small changes that were accumulating like evidence at a crime scene. The pulse was climbing past 118 now. The O2 sat was dropping to 91%. Something was wrong inside the commander's chest, something that was building pressure with every minute they didn't act. Katie had seen cardiac pathology wearing 100 different faces. She had trained medics to recognize these exact signs under conditions where the only equipment available was what they could carry. Dr. Hargrove remained in the bay, supervising, his presence a constant reminder that everyone here answered to the hierarchy he controlled. He positioned himself at the head of the bed, his authority radiating outward in waves that made the nurses adjust their posture and the patient's family pull back. This was his domain. This was his territory. And Katie Rodriguez, moving silently through it in her navy scrubs with her invisible scars, was simply one more piece of equipment to be positioned according to his specifications. But something in her recognition of James Vickers, something in her reading of his clinical status, something in the way her muscle memory was already calculating the procedures that might be necessary, all of it was creating a pressure inside her own chest that no amount of training could completely suppress. "The documentation is incomplete, Nurse Rodriguez. In 23 years, I have never seen such sloppy charting." His voice cut through Commander Vickers' hospital room like a scalpel finding muscle. Katie stood at the foot of the bed, chart in hand, feeling the weight of 3 sets of eyes, Mrs. Vickers, their grown daughter Sarah, and the commander himself, groggy but conscious enough to register the tone. Hargrove moved closer, his tailored jacket catching the overhead fluorescent light with a kind of gleaming authority. The man carried himself like someone who had never been questioned, never had to explain, never once doubted his right to reshape reality around him. Katie took one measured breath. "Doctor, the documentation follows protocol. The timestamp and vital sign intervals are complete per Mercy General standards." She kept her voice level, clinical, the way you speak about facts rather than defend against accusations. It was the wrong move. Hargrove's jaw tightened. The smallest gesture. A predator recognizing resistance. "Are you contradicting me in front of a patient's family?" His voice dropped to that dangerous register where anger becomes institutional power. "This is exactly why temps never last here. They lack the judgment to know when to accept correction. This is why I don't hire from agencies." Commander Vickers shifted in the bed, uncomfortable not from pain but from witnessing hierarchy reassert itself. Mrs. Vickers looked away, suddenly interested in the monitors, the 4 stands, anything that wasn't this moment. Katie felt a tear threaten at the corner of her eye. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. Didn't let it fall. "I'll review the chart again, Doctor." Each word deliberate. Each word controlled. Hargrove turned to the family with the smooth pivot of someone who had performed this exact pivot 100 times. "We apologize for the substandard care. I'll personally oversee everything from here." He said it like he was conferring a gift, like his presence alone was a form of medicine. Then he left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with a confidence that came not from competence but from 23 years of never being challenged by anyone who mattered. Katie stood for exactly 8 seconds after he left. Then she documented the medication administration time in the chart with precise handwriting, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her face showing nothing at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room at 1300. Katie had not eaten in 9 hours. A packet of turkey and cheese, 2 slices of wheat bread, 1 apple purchased from the gift shop for $6. 6 nurses sat around the small table, laughing about something a patient's family member had said that morning, something about hospital coffee tasting like they extracted it from the walls themselves. It was the kind of laughter that meant they were healing, that they were still human underneath the scrubs. The moment Katie sat down, the laughter stopped. Not gradually. Completely. One nurse, Jennifer, someone Katie had trained on proper full-line insertion 3 months ago, gathered her containers. 2 others followed. Then the rest. Within 30 seconds, Katie sat alone at a table for 8, a cold sandwich in her hands, the smell of their vacated meals lingering like a ghost of belonging. She did not look up. She did not react. She simply sat and stared at her sandwich, and one tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it without looking away from her hands, and she did not wipe another. The night shift began at 2100. Katie arrived 22 minutes early and found her name on the public disciplinary board near the time clock, a bulletin board where shift assignments and notices were posted where anyone could see, where the entire hospital could read your failure. Cade Rodriguez, written warning, insubordination, questioned physician orders regarding scan timing for patient Vickers. Insubordination. The word sat there like a diagnosis. Staff members walked past, reading it, whispering. A younger nurse Katie had mentored through her first arterial line placement averted her eyes. The message was clear: do not associate with her. She carried something contagious now. Something that could spread to your own employment record, your own reputation, your own fragile position in the hierarchy. Dr. Hargrove stood 20 feet down the corridor, watching. Not hiding. Simply standing. Observing. Making sure she saw that he had made his point permanent. That he had moved beyond humiliation into documentation, into the permanent record, into the kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice anymore. Katie approached the board. She read her name. She read the violation. She took one measured breath. Then she turned and found his eyes across the distance. "I've been dismissed by better men than you, Doctor." Her voice was quiet. It carried. And they had the courage to do it in private. His jaw tightened. His shoulders stiffened. For a moment, just a moment, the confidence wavered. She had done it again. Made him feel small without raising her voice. Without aggression. Without anything except the truth spoken clearly into silence. She had challenged the very authority structure that transformed his mediocre surgical skills into untouchable institutional power, and he could not respond to that challenge without destroying the architecture that made him untouchable. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned away. The office door closed behind him at 21:18. Katie continued down to the supply room and began checking the crash cart medications with mechanical precision. But she could imagine the calls. She had lived through institutional retaliation before, back when she wore a different uniform and the Pentagon's reach extended further than state law. She knew the pattern. The complaint would escalate. The network would activate. Men would make phone calls to other men, and power would consolidate around the narrative that Hargrove was constructing. By 21:40, Dr. Hargrove sat at his desk with his phone to his ear. Gerald Masterson, board chair of Mercy General's executive committee, answered on the second ring. A golf buddy from the country club. Someone who understood the value of protecting institutional reputation. "We have a liability issue," Hargrove said. "A temp nurse practicing beyond scope, questioning protocols. I need you aware before this becomes litigation." His tone was clinical. Not angry. Not emotional. Just a physician reporting an unfortunate circumstance that required attention from people who understood how to handle such things. The second call went to Dr. Patricia Chen, board member, cardiologist, someone who sat in on the Joint Commission reviews that determined hospital accreditation. "The Rodriguez situation," he said. "She's created documentation irregularities that could expose us during the next Joint Commission review." A different angle. Same threat. The third call went to the chief nursing officer. "I want her employment references verified. Something doesn't add up with this woman." Not a question. A directive wrapped in the language of reasonable concern. Then he hung up and sat in the darkness of his office at 21:56, confident that the machinery was moving. That by morning, she would be finished. The temp agency that had placed Katie Rodriguez at Mercy General existed on a quiet suburban street in Arlington, Virginia, for states away. The agency director, a woman named Martha Cross who had been conducting background checks for CIA placements for 17 years without ever using those words aloud, received Hargrove's inquiry via phone at 22:01. He wanted verification of Katie's references, confirmation of her credentials, assurance that she was who she claimed to be. Martha Cross took his information and told him she would follow up by end of business. Then she ended the call and stared at her computer screen for 7 seconds before pulling up an internal system that had no name and no official designation. She typed a name. The system returned a file that had been sealed at the federal level. Rodriguez, Catherine Ann. Designation, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Status, terminated service, classified reason. Location, operational since placement, Savannah, GA. Cover designation, nursing temp, Mercy General Hospital. Alert protocol, contact compromised. Activate immediate containment procedures. Refer to oversight. Do not advise subject. Martha picked up a phone that was connected to a secure network. The number she dialed rang in a federal building where 3 people monitored Katie's status. By the time Hargrove made his second phone call, a decision was already being made in a room Katie would never see about whether she could continue breathing in the life she had built. Katie sat across from her son Miguel at their kitchen table at 1900 that evening. He wore his Marine dress uniform, dress blue Charlie, because he had driven straight from base to check on her before his leave ended. His hair was cut to regulation, his posture the kind of straightness that came from 3 years of institutionalized discipline. He was handsome in the way young soldiers are handsome, with the kind of confidence that hasn't yet been eroded by experience. "Mom, I'm visiting Commander Vickers tomorrow. He's still in Mercy General, right?" Miguel bit into a piece of lasagna Katie had prepared without any of her usual precision. "He's a hero. Did you know he pulled me out of an ambush in Sangin? Saved my life. He came under fire for 3 minutes straight to get to my position. He's the best officer I've ever served with." Katie set down her fork. "You're taking care of him? That's incredible." For a moment, the temptation was almost unbearable. To tell Miguel that she knew Commander Vickers. That she had been in Sangin. That she had been there when everything went sideways, when they were all running through the Helmand province dust and the Pentagon decided that what they had witnessed needed to disappear. That she had chosen to disappear with it. Instead, she said, "He's a good man. You're lucky to have served with him." Miguel nodded, satisfied. He finished his lasagna and talked about his barracks, his training cycle, his hopes for advancement. Katie listened and asked the right questions and kept her hands visible on the table where her son could see that everything was fine, everything was normal, everything was exactly the way it had always been. At 21:40, after Miguel fell asleep on the couch in his dress blues, Katie went to her bedroom and pulled her jacket from the closet. The lining had a small seam, barely visible, sewn with thread that matched the fabric. She slipped her fingers inside and drew out the faded unit patch from her last deployment, the Sangin Valley, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The colors had bled over time. The stitching was worn. But the symbol was still legible. Still hers. She held it like a rosary, like a prayer, like a promise to the people she had left there, and the people she had promised to never acknowledge again. Outside, rain began to fall on Savannah, gentle and steady, the sound of it against the window like water finding its way home. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the windows of Mercy General like a countdown clock nobody could stop. Inside his office on the 4th floor, Dr. Hargrove sat behind mahogany that cost more than most people's cars, his fingers already moving across his phone screen with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years building a network designed to protect exactly this kind of moment. He didn't see a nurse who had saved a patient's life. He saw a threat to the careful architecture of his authority, and threats required immediate dismantling. His first call went to Martin Sterling, the hospital board chairman. Hargrove's voice carried the practiced concern of a surgeon who had never once doubted his own judgment. "Martin, I need to escalate something. Rodriguez, the RN on Vickers' case, she's practicing significantly outside her scope. Questioned my clinical orders. Now she's inserting herself into resident decisions. This is a liability issue, frankly. Sterling listened. Sterling always listened. Hargrove had helped place Sterling's daughter in a fellowship 3 years ago. Favors were currency, and Hargrove's account was flush. The second call went to Patricia Hayes, Chief of Hospital Operations. Same message. Different angle. Patient safety concern. We need documentation. The third call reached Dr. James Conrad, the medical director, Hargrove's closest institutional ally. We're looking at a scope violation that nearly compromised patient care. I'm documenting it formally. You'll probably hear from our legal team by morning. By the time Hargrove set down his phone, the machinery was already moving. He had activated what he did best, the invisible network of obligation, reciprocity, and institutional memory that made him untouchable. He wasn't a man who raised his voice. He was a man who made phone calls. The temp agency that had placed Katie at Mercy General was called Crown Staffing Solutions, headquartered in Arlington with satellite offices in every major city. Hargrove found the number in his files. He kept meticulous records of everyone connected to the hospital, and dialed with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting answers. The placement coordinator who answered was named Derek. Hargrove introduced himself as Dr. Hargrove, cardiac surgery, and explained that he needed to verify something about one of their nurse placements. I want to review Catherine Rodriguez's reference materials. The originals, not copies. There are some concerns about her qualifications and her conduct on our floor. Derek hesitated. That hesitation was all Hargrove needed to know. He had found leverage. A temporary staffing agency's entire business model depended on client hospitals remaining satisfied. One complaint from a cardiac surgeon to a hospital board was ammunition they couldn't ignore. Derek promised to send the file within the hour. What Derek didn't know, what nobody at Crown Staffing Solutions knew except for 3 people in Langley, Virginia, was that Catherine Rodriguez's reference file was maintained by a closed-door federal operation, and that the moment Hargrove's request hit their system, alarms began lighting up on classified terminals. The rain continued its assault on the city. Savannah felt smaller now, compressed between sky and earth, the kind of weather that made people move faster, think less clearly. Katie had maintained her composure through the public humiliation, through the write-up board, through the moment she'd walked past Dr. Hargrove in the break room and watched him tense, expecting her to shatter, to cry, to collapse into the role of victim he'd been directing her toward. She hadn't given him that satisfaction. Instead, she'd simply picked up her coffee and left the room, and that, somehow, had infuriated him more than tears ever could have. She didn't know, as she moved through her shift on the cardiac unit, that a chain reaction had begun. She didn't know that administrative systems were cross-referencing her employment file. She didn't know that Crown Staffing Solutions was suddenly on a 3-way conference call with people who wouldn't identify their agency but whose authority was absolute. She only knew that her hands moved through the motions of her work with the muscle memory of someone who had done it under conditions far worse than institutional politics. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the administrative investigator had already arrived at Mercy General. His name was Richard Bancroft, a thin man with the manner of someone who had spent his entire career asking questions he already knew the answers to. He carried a folder and moved with the particular confidence of institutional authority. The conversation with hospital administration lasted 17 minutes. Then Bancroft was given Katie's locker location, her work schedule, and the information that she would be arriving for the day's shift at 6:45 a.m. Mercy General's HR director, a woman named Janet who had worked there for 12 years and who had always thought Katie was one of the few good ones, watched as Bancroft positioned himself near the time clock with a cardboard box, the same kind used for moving personal effects, sitting on a chair beside him. Katie clocked in at 6:06 a.m. The fluorescent lights of the hospital's main corridor seemed particularly harsh that morning, or perhaps it was just that she could already sense something was wrong. The air pressure changes when disaster is approaching. She had learned this in places where disaster came with alarms and without. Bancroft stepped forward before she could move toward the cardiac unit. Catherine Rodriguez. The way he said her name was clinical, procedural, the kind of tone used when something was already decided. I'm from the hospital's administrative compliance office. I need to inform you that you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation into allegations of practicing outside your license scope. The words came in the precise order of someone reading from a prepared statement. There were other phrases: effective immediately, pending investigation, your badge is being deactivated, please collect your personal belongings. The cardboard box waited like an open mouth. Katie moved to her locker in the nurse's locker room on the second floor. 2 other nurses were changing into scrubs. She recognized both of them. Neither looked at her directly. She packed the thermos she'd brought from home, the book she read during breaks, a photo of Miguel in his marine dress uniform. The box filled quickly. Her entire professional existence at Mercy General, 3 years of 12-hour shifts, of holding patients' hands through the worst moments of their lives, of working under Dr. Hargrove's contempt while asking nothing in return, reduced to objects that fit in a box you could carry with one arm. Bancroft was waiting at the main entrance when she left the building. If you have any questions, the Department of Human Resources will be in contact. He didn't offer to carry the box. She carried it herself, past the security guard who had handed it to her, into the rain that was still falling on Savannah like the city itself was weeping. Katie's house was a small craftsman bungalow on Victory Drive, 3 bedrooms and a back porch that faced a small garden where she grew tomatoes that Miguel said tasted like home. She had never brought Hargrove's contempt into this space. She had maintained the separation between the person she had to be at Mercy General and the person she was in the quiet of her own home. That separation broke at 2:07 p.m., exactly 90 minutes after she had left the hospital. Miguel found her at the kitchen table still in her scrubs. She hadn't changed. Hadn't showered. Hadn't moved from the spot where she'd set the cardboard box and sat down and allowed her hands to stop working. The rain drummed against the kitchen windows. A single tear had escaped her eye. She wiped it without looking away from nothing in particular, and then she had simply sat there, waiting, the way soldiers wait in foxholes for dawn. Miguel was 19 now, in the 3rd year of his own service with 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, the same unit where Commander Vickers held authority. He had her face, but his held the particular openness of youth not yet worn down by institutional machinery. He came through the back door with the confidence of someone with nowhere else to be and stopped when he saw her. For exactly 2 seconds, he didn't move. Then he moved toward the kitchen table and set down his own bag with careful precision. "Mom." His voice carried the fragility of someone suddenly understanding that the person across from him was not invulnerable. "Why are you home?" "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" Katie looked at her son, this young man who had been born into a life of compartmentalized secrets, who had inherited the particular loneliness that comes from having a parent who cannot fully explain where they have been or what they have done, and realized that the careful architecture of her invisibility had finally collapsed. "I was fired," she said quietly. She had not cried, would not cry, but the words came out as though her voice was traveling a very long distance. "There was an incident. A patient. I did what was necessary, and they terminated my employment for exceeding my scope of practice." She paused. The hospital doesn't understand that sometimes the protocols don't account for what needs to actually happen in order to keep someone alive. Miguel sat down across from her. Outside, the rain fell on Savannah with the patient certainty of water finding its way home. Neither of them spoke. The silence lasted exactly the amount of time it took for Katie's phone to vibrate once against the kitchen table, a number she didn't recognize, no caller ID, just a Washington, D.C. area code appearing on her screen like a summons from another life entirely. She didn't answer it. Not yet. She looked at her son instead. "I need to make some calls," she said finally, her voice already shifting into something different, something older, something that had been sleeping and was now beginning to wake. "But I need you to understand something first. Whatever happens next, it's not your fault. It was never going to work. I was always going to be found." Her phone vibrated again. The same number. More insistent this time. The monitor flatlined at 2,347 hours. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins like cords beneath the skin. Blood pressure dropping, 120/80 to 95/60 in the span of 4 minutes. Commander Vickers' chest rose and fell, but something fundamental had shifted. The venous return was compromised. The pericardium was filling with blood. Dr. Patel, the night shift resident, stood frozen at the ultrasound console, hands trembling over the probe. 28 years old. For months past his final exams. His eyes darted to the monitor, to the patient, back to the ultrasound screen where a dark fluid collection surrounded the heart like an accusation. Around him, the ICU night staff, 3 nurses, a respiratory tech, a unit secretary, exchanged glances that said the same thing: someone needed to decide. Someone needed to act. Katie stood at the bedside, already moving. Mrs. Vickers gripped her husband's hand from the chair. Their daughter Sarah had stepped into the corner, phone in hand, trying to call her father's commanding officer. Cardiac tamponade, Katie said. Not a question. A diagnosis. Her voice dropped an octave, the voice of someone who'd identified this condition in the field, who'd felt for the paradoxical pulse, who'd known that without intervention, the next monitor strip would be asystole. We need a needle. Now. Dr. Patel's mouth opened. Closed. I should call cardiology after. Katie was already moving toward the supply cart. Right now he has for minutes. No please. No apology. Just fact. The resident felt the shift in the room, the power moving like current toward someone who actually knew what to do. He swallowed and reached for the phone. The preparation was muscle memory wearing a nurse's uniform. Betadine. Sterile field. The harsh smell of antiseptic flooded the small space around Vickers' chest like a chemical warning. Katie's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in dust storms and mortar fire, in blown-out clinic tents where the only light came from headlamps and the only anesthetic was the certainty of what happened if she hesitated. An 18-gauge spinal needle. Syringe. The ultrasound probe in her left hand, the needle in her right. She identified the landmark, the subxiphoid approach, 3 fingers below the xiphoid process, the needle angled at 30 degrees toward the left shoulder. The ultrasound showed it in real time, the pericardial sac distended like a water balloon, dark fluid pressing the heart into a smaller and smaller space. No room to pump. No room to live. Katie's eyes locked on the screen. She advanced the needle. The staff nurse beside her, Jenkins, young, 3 years at Mercy General, held her breath. Respiratory tech Monroe stood motionless. The entire night crew had stopped moving because they were watching someone step into a moment that only certain people could navigate, and they all felt it. The needle entered the pericardial space. The resistance changed. Katie aspirated. Dark blood filled the syringe. Blood that should have been circulating through the commander's coronary arteries instead of crushing his heart from the outside. 50 ccs. The needle stayed steady. 100 ccs. Her hands like surgical instruments themselves, no tremor, no hesitation, just the anatomical precision of someone who'd learned this lesson while shells landed close enough to rattle teeth. 150 ccs. 200 ccs total. She withdrew the needle and applied pressure to the site with gauze, eyes still on the monitor. The transformation was immediate. Blood pressure, 75/45. Then 85/50. Then 95/60 as the pressure released, as the heart found room to beat again, as oxygen finally saturated tissue that had begun the long descent into cellular death. The heart sounds cleared, the muffled quality vanishing like a fog lifting. A sinus rhythm. Steady. Strong. Alive. Commander Vickers gasped, color returning to his face like someone surfacing from water. His wife squeezed his hand. Sarah put her phone down and covered her mouth. The entire night staff stood frozen. Not moving. Not breathing. just staring at the woman in teal scrubs who'd stepped into their crisis and solved it the way only certain people could. Dr. Patel was already on the phone with cardiology. Successful pericardiocentesis, 200 ccs of frank blood, patient stable, needs surgical evaluation for definitive repair. Katie stepped back from the bedside, peeled off her gloves, and spoke with the voice of someone giving orders to people she outranked, though they didn't know it yet. Call cardiology for a surgical window. He'll need definitive repair within the next 6 hours. She turned to the resident. Get an EKG. Troponin levels. I want echo results every 2 hours. Dr. Patel nodded. Actually complied, the way people do when authority walks in wearing a uniform that nobody can see. Jenkins moved to the monitor, documenting vitals. How did you? She started, but couldn't finish the question. How did you know? How did you move like that? How did your hands not shake? Katie took one measured breath. One single tear escaped without permission, the only crack in the surface she'd maintained for 36 months at Mercy General. She wiped it without looking away from the monitor, without acknowledging it existed. A long time ago, she said quietly, and the subject was closed. By 0700 hours, Dr. Hargrove arrived for morning rounds. The night report moved through the hierarchy like a betrayal. Emergency pericardiocentesis performed at 2,347 hours, patient stabilized, no complications, cardiology consulted for surgical window. Hargrove's face darkened. Not surprise. Something worse. Recognition that the hierarchy he'd maintained for 2 decades had been breached by someone he'd classified as subordinate. The same nurse he'd publicly written up. The same nurse he'd scheduled for termination. The same nurse had just performed a procedure that his protocol would have delayed for committee approval, and that patient had just been saved by muscle memory and military training that no hospital orientation manual could teach. By 0900 hours, he made 4 phone calls. The first to the CNO. The second to a board member named Sterling. The third to the risk management director. The fourth to the temporary staffing agency where Katie's background check had already raised flags about employment gaps and redacted references. By 1100 hours, Donald Pierce the investigator was walking through Mercy General's main entrance again, the same investigator who'd handed her the termination paperwork, except this time Hargrove had called ahead. This time the board had been activated. This time there was institutional momentum behind the decision. Katie was called to the CNO's office at 1400 hours. The same office where 3 board members had already been briefed. The same office where risk management had already calculated the liability of a nurse performing advanced procedures without explicit authorization. The same office where Hargrove had already drawn his conclusions. Pierce sat with a file open on his lap. Performing procedures outside nursing scope. Your written warning from last week for insubordination. Irregularities in your employment history. He didn't look up. The hospital has decided to terminate your employment. Effective immediately. The CNO shifted uncomfortably. She'd seen the EKG results. She'd seen the echo report. She'd seen the note from cardiology praising the pericardiocentesis as textbook execution. But she'd also seen the phone calls from board members. She'd also seen the memo from risk management. Institutional pressure had weight, and weight bent toward self-preservation. Security escort. Locker packing. The jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the one Katie had kept pressed against her ribs for 3 years. A photo of Miguel in marine dress uniform. The stethoscope that had hung around her neck through 3 years of quiet competence that nobody measured and nobody appreciated until the moment it mattered. Frank, the security guard, handed her the cardboard box with apologetic eyes. He'd worked Mercy General for 14 years. He'd seen competence. He'd seen arrogance. He knew which was which. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. What you did last night, everyone's talking about it. Katie carried the box through the ICU at 1430 hours. Past Commander Vickers' room where he was sitting up, color in his face, the monitor showing a steady heartbeat that shouldn't have existed without her hands. Past the nurse's station where her former colleagues looked away, trained by Dr. Hargrove's example to understand that compassion was a liability and silence was survival. Past the break room where she'd been publicly humiliated. Past the same fluorescent-lit hallways that had held her for 36 months of invisibility. The kitchen table was where Miguel found her at 1,430 hours. Still in scrubs. It was mid-afternoon and she hadn't moved, hadn't showered, hadn't changed. Just sat with her hands flat on the laminate surface, staring at nothing. The cardboard box on the floor beside her, the jacket visible inside, the photograph of Miguel in uniform just barely showing. Miguel was still in his dress uniform from visiting Commander Vickers. He'd been there when his commanding officer woke up, stable, breathing on his own, color returning to his face as if he'd been given back his life. The nurses had whispered about it. "Your mom," one had said to Miguel. "She saved him last night. She did something incredible." He'd asked what procedure. The nurse had just shaken her head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like it." Now he found his mother at the kitchen table, and he knew immediately that something fundamental had broken. Not in her composure, that remained intact, that remained unshattered. But in the weight of the moment, in the fact that she was home at 14:30 on a working day in scrubs that were supposed to mean something, that were supposed to represent the invisible work that kept people alive. Miguel kneeled beside her chair, the way he'd done when he was a child and scared. "Mom." His voice was young. Terrified. "Why are you home early? What happened?" Katie couldn't speak. Not because of shame, shame was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. But because the answer to his question would require her to tell him what she couldn't tell him. That she'd saved his commanding officer's life and been fired for it. That she was Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez, that her service record existed in sealed archives, that the Pentagon had ordered her into darkness to keep him safe. That she'd witnessed something in Sangin that the government needed buried, and that Hargrove's phone calls had probably triggered classified alerts that were already moving through Washington. She reached out and squeezed his hand. Held it. Said nothing. Miguel sat beside her chair, still in uniform, still holding her hand, afraid in a way that only children of warriors understand, the fear that comes from sensing a parent's exhaustion, the kind that couldn't be fixed by sleep. That was when the sound started. Low at first. Then growing. The distinctive thud of military-grade rotor blades cutting air, the sound that meant something official was moving toward them. The sound that meant the classified world she'd been ordered to hide from was crossing over into daylight. A Black Hawk helicopter. Military transport. Rotor wash shaking the windows of their quiet Savannah neighborhood at 1,430 hours on an ordinary afternoon that was about to become the day everything changed. The rotor wash hit the hospital like a physical force. Mercy General's rooftop shook as the UH-60M Black Hawk descended at exactly 1,447 hours, 48 hours and 17 minutes after Katie Rodriguez cleaned out her locker and walked into anonymous obscurity. Two Marines in dress blue stepped onto the landing pad, their movements precise, deliberate. Not security. Not visitors. The kind of precision that belonged to men who moved through classified spaces for a living. Inside the ICU, the fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hymn. Commander Vickers was sitting up in bed now, color returning to his face, the miracle of a pericardiocentesis performed by hands that had done field medicine under mortar fire. His wife held his hand. His daughter Sarah stood by the window. They didn't know what was about to walk through those doors. None of them did. The Marines entered like water finding its level. Eye scanning. Efficient. The younger one, fresh-faced, maybe 24, approached the nursing station. His voice was controlled, flat. "We're looking for Senior Chief Rodriguez." Silence. The kind of silence that happens when people hear something that doesn't fit the room they're standing in. Miguel Rodriguez, home on medical leave from Camp Lejeune, was visiting Commander Vickers when the Marines arrived. He was still in his Marine dress blues, the creases sharp as knife edges. His mother's son, His uniform suddenly felt heavier when he heard that voice, that title, that rank spoken aloud in a hospital corridor where Katie Rodriguez was supposed to be a nobody nurse with a temporary agency badge. He stepped forward. His own voice steady, military-trained. "That's my mother. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez." The room didn't go silent. It died. Every monitor, every beep, every breath, nothing existed except that one sentence hanging in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Commander Vickers' eyes widened. His daughter grabbed the bed rail. His wife's hand went to her mouth. A Navy captain emerged from behind the Marines, aged like granite, moving like she carried weight most people would shatter under. She held a folder, the kind that didn't travel outside sealed facilities. Her voice cut through the room with the precision of a scalpel. Senior Chief Rodriguez served with distinction in Naval Special Warfare Command. She opened the folder. "Read like a judge at a tribunal. Bronze Star with Valor." Pause. The room absorbed it. Second Bronze Star with Valor. Another pause. Her eyes moved to the next page. Third Bronze Star with Valor. Each medal its own sentence. Each one a moment of reorientation. 2 Purple Hearts. The captain's voice didn't change, but something in her jaw tightened. Navy Cross for extracting 12 wounded Marines under fire in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, when their medical officer was KIA. 12 men walked out. 12 men came home because Senior Chief Rodriguez walked toward the bullets instead of away from them. Miguel's eyes were wet. Not crying. Transmitting. The way a son looks at a mother when the mask drops and suddenly he understands. Then the Master Chief stepped forward. Weathered like driftwood, scarred like a teaching tool. His voice was low, rough-edged, the kind of voice that had ordered men to do impossible things in impossible places. "I'm Master Chief Gunnery Sergeant Clayton from Naval Special Warfare Development Group. I'm here representing Command." He pulled out another file, handwritten, no official letterhead, classified protocols spilling across pages that probably should have stayed in a vault. Senior Chief Rodriguez conducted counterterrorism operations in 13 countries. Not 13 missions. 13 countries. Kandahar. Mombasa. Aden. I could keep going, but this folder is still classified. He looked directly at Miguel. "Your mother trained 317 combat medics who are still operational. 17 of them are currently deployed. 41 have been promoted to leadership positions. Every single one of them would have followed her into hell and back. Katie was not here. But she was everywhere in that room now, like a voice echoing through years and continents and classified operations that existed only in sealed archives and the nightmares of men who'd been saved by her hands." Dr. Hargrove stood frozen in his doorway, watching from his office. Not moving. Not breathing. Just watching. The captain continued. "The Sangin operation was cleared for public disclosure after a presidential finding 3 weeks ago. Declassification protocols have been completed. Senior Chief Rodriguez is being recalled to active duty to establish a training program for naval combat medics at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. She's required at Bethesda within 72 hours. 72 hours. The same amount of time it took to destroy a career. The same amount of time it took to expose one." Dr. Hargrove's hands were shaking now. His face had gone the color of antiseptic. The room he built, the hierarchy, the control, the kingdom where he was apex and everyone else was beneath him, it was dissolving. Not with anger or confrontation, but with the simple, irrefutable weight of truth. She had never told them. She had never claimed it. She had simply been it, invisible, carrying medals and secrets and the weight of saved lives while he threw cardboard boxes. Commander Vickers extended his hand to Miguel, then to the Marines. "I served with officers who would have been better soldiers if they'd had half her composure." His wife started to cry. Not sad tears. Recognition. The kind of tears that come when you finally see someone you've been standing next to all along. 2 weeks later, Frank the security guard was arranging trash cans near the hospital entrance when Dr. Hargrove arrived at Mercy General at 0830 hours. He was wearing a cheap polo shirt, the kind you get from a warehouse club. His face had hollowed out. The board had voted. The insurance company had sent their ultimatum. His network had dissolved like salt in water. 3 colleagues refused his calls. The chief nursing officer who processed Katie's termination had been formally reprimanded. The temp agency that CIA front he'd tried to pressure had sent a letter from federal counsel threatening legal action for harassment of a protected intelligence asset. Frank stepped forward, holding a cardboard box identical to the one Katie had carried 48 hours earlier. His voice carried barely concealed satisfaction. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Hargrove took the box. There wasn't anything in it except a few personal items that HIPAA required they return. He drove to the edge of Savannah with the box on the passenger seat, like evidence. 6 months collapsed into a montage of karmic precision. Hargrove couldn't get surgical privileges anywhere in the region. The publicity had followed him like a stain. No hospital would take the liability. His malpractice insurance lapsed. His boardroom was a folding table at Savannah Plaza Shopping Center, fluorescent overhead lights making everything look like a crime scene. His sign was handwritten, laminated with clear tape, affordable supplemental insurance, free quotes. Families walked past. Nobody recognized the surgeon. Nobody saw the man who'd walked those hospital corridors like he owned the building. Meanwhile, Katie stood in dress blues at Naval Medical Center, Bethesda, teaching a classroom of young corpsmen in their first week of combat medicine training. Her chest was a ribbon rack now, the medals finally visible, no longer hidden. But the detail that stopped people in their tracks was the patch on her left shoulder. Faded. Weathered. Sangin Valley, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the unit patch she'd kept sewn inside her civilian jacket lining all these years, the one that marked her as someone who had walked into the worst and walked back out. Miguel sent his mother a photo 6 months later. He'd taken it on his phone during a weekend visit to Savannah, framing it carefully. Split screen. Left side, Dr. Hargrove at his folding table, alone, watching people ignore him. Right side, Katie in dress blues, surrounded by 6 young corpsmen, a unit patch visible on her sleeve, her hand guiding a recruit through the steps of pericardiocentesis on a training dummy. Both images caught in the same moment. 2 different worlds. One man watching his past. One woman building the future. Katie's text response to her son was simple: "Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs." The camera holds on that photograph as the truth settles. Katie Rodriguez never needed anyone to tell her who she was. She'd always known. The world just finally caught up to what had been true all along, that the quietest person in the room might be the strongest. That dignity isn't about screaming your accomplishments. It's about carrying them with grace until the moment comes when the world has no choice but to see. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, share this story. Subscribe to see more hidden heroes finally step into the light. And comment, what would you have done if you were Katie? Would you have let them see your truth, or stayed invisible?